Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site. Also, digitalassetlife.com, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Let's talk about Shannon Sharpe. Let me say up front, I'm not going to reach a conclusion here on what Shannon Sharpe did. Right? I'm not. The dialogue I want here is just on whether he did the best thing he could to minimize damages by settling the case for, according to reports, more than $20 million. Right? That's all I'm going to address here. I understand that things can look a certain way and not be that way. I also understand that guys could have histories where they're accused of things um, in part because of their actions, but also possibly because of their high profiles, their celebrity status, where they are in life, what financial gain the accuser could gain from making the allegation. Right? So just understand, here we're going to be a little agnostic. But let me make the case as to why, in fact, Shannon Sharpe is making the right move by paying more than $20 million to his accuser. Right? Let's also talk about how he could have reduced the risk by structuring his life a little bit differently. Right? Let's talk about it. First, let me just say that Shannon Sharpe is a public figure. He is a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Right? He is someone who is also, and this is very important to know, an entrepreneur who is involved in his own ventures. And those ventures have multi-million dollar price possibilities. Right? Club Shay Shay, folks, that is very popular. That is very influential. Right? I assume that an entrepreneur like Shannon Sharpe has several ideas. Club Shay Shay is a great one. But there might be other things that he wants to do. Right? He endangers all of that by having this linger. Right? He endangers all of that by losing the narrative. Understand, because Shannon Sharpe is a high profile celebrity, we'll call him, right? Because he's a public figure. If he didn't reach a settlement that didn't have confidentiality provisions, then he would run the risk of the accuser writing a book, for example. Right? We live in the United States, free press, people can tell their stories. The accuser could write a book, and that book could have a narrative that Shannon Sharpe doesn't agree with. Right? It could have salacious stories that might dissuade sponsors or, more importantly, consumers from looking at Shannon Sharpe's entrepreneurial work. What he's doing on Club Shay Shay, the videos he's making talking about social matters, sports matters, whatever he wants to discuss. Right? So just understand, by entering into this settlement, Shannon Sharpe gets the opportunity to gain greater control over the narrative. Right? Let me just say, too, And we know this just hearing the Diddy case, which I thought was overcharged, where I thought the prosecution really tried to make that case into something it wasn't. Right? Here, you have a relationship that has eccentricities, we'll call it. Right? Racial differences, age differences. Right? Let me also just add, if the relationship had been a same sex relationship, many of the public would have been titillated by that as well. You would have had a lot of looky-loos. Right, folks? We can pretend that, we're all racially equal on a political basis as well as on a social basis. As a black male, I know that's not the case. Right? I know that's not the case. Right? As someone who's had non-black girlfriends, I know that's not the case. Right? So let me just say here, Shannon is up against it for a host of reasons. Right? He's a different race. Let me just say, not just genetically. In other words, he's a dark-skinned brother. He's not a guy who can pass. But socially. Right? Shannon, I know Shannon is fluid. I know Shannon has white friends. I know Shannon can hold his own, I'm sure, in white circles. At least it appears that way on TV. But the bottom line is Shannon knew who Cat Williams was. Right? Shannon wanted the interview with Cat Williams. Shannon is a guy who's an active participant in black culture. Right? So here he is with this white woman, and I'm just telling you, just the interracial part would have certain people upset. Right? My mom's no longer with us. I'm just telling you that in addition to getting a speech from her when I was growing up, that, you've got to date people who look like you. Just understand, whenever there was something in the news, like, let's say, the O.J. Simpson trial, right? All I heard about wasn't the murder. What I was hearing about was the racial differences. Right? Even though Nicole had dated other black men, even though Nicole had biracial friends, right? Even though their social circle was multiracial, right? All I was hearing about was the race difference, right? And understand too, it's not like OJ would necessarily know who Cat Williams was, right? I would say that socially, Shannon Sharpe, is more involved with the black community than O.J. Simpson, who was on my wall as a kid, who I actually, once was in the same restaurant as, right? But O.J. wasn't a guy who you got the feeling hung out with a lot of brothers outside of A.C. Cowlings and other NFL players, right? If you go back to the 1960s, O.J. talked about how he wasn't on the same page as the black Muslims because he liked pork too much. Right? Shannon Sharpe is more a member of, the African American community. He's more in sync culturally with, that community than, let's say, O.J. Simpson was. But yet, O.J., a black guy living in Brentwood, with many white friends, who was, making movies like The Naked Gun and stuff like that. My mom, all she saw was OJ's with a white girl. It was even worse than that. He's with a white girl after having been married to a black woman and having, kids with that black woman. Right? Just understand, Shannon Sharpe, the race angle is big. You're a black defendant. You really have to ask yourself, you know, how would this play in front of a civil jury? Right? Let me say, too, uh, age. I'm just telling you, you know, if you're dating someone and that person is younger than you by 10 years or more, people notice it. Right? You're held to a different level of scrutiny, particularly in a case where the younger person is claiming that they were abused. Right? That's very important. Don't obsess. Don't focus just on race here, folks. You have an age dynamic. Older women know this. This case would be viewed differently if Shannon was going out with a woman in her mid-50s. Right? The fact that he's with someone who's decades younger matters here. Right? It would weaken the legs on which he'd have to stand in court. Right? I don't have time to be PC. The America I live in is the America of today, not some perfect world. Right? The age difference would hurt. This would have a David versus Goliath type feel, where a lot of people would then start rooting for the underdog. Let me say this too. Shannon, in his past, has had allegations of sexual harassment, at a minimum, if not abuse. Right, folks? The prior history would be devastating in a court of law. Devastating. Now, let me just say here, you know, some people are more sexually adventurous than others. Right? You'd be surprised. If you're into S&M, and that might be the case here. If you're into restraints, if you're into things like handcuffs, right, folks, I'm just telling you, a huge portion of the public is not ready to accept the idea that their neighbors might be involved in such a lifestyle. Right? The Diddy case, people were obsessed with baby oil. Right? Gee, what's the big deal? Right? Well, folks, just understand it is a big deal for many. Right? So let's just say here, if in fact Shannon Sharpe was involved in sex that involved handcuffs, restraints, right? Any sex where someone is role-playing and it involves a power dynamic, right? Let's say, you know, sex where one person wears a collar, where there's a dominant and a submissive. Let me just say, I know for many watching this video, they're thinking, well, what's the big deal? Consenting adults can be consenting adults. We still live in that world, don't we? Folks, if you impanel, 12 people, do you think all of them are going to share your values? Right? I mean, understand, on these crime shows on TV, right, whenever they mention group sex, it's never mentioned favorably. Never. Right? This is on nonfiction shows where they're talking about crimes that happened. Right? The minute they get to a group sex dynamic, particularly one involving an age gap, right? Many people have the assumption that it's non-consensual. Folks, that assumption would doom Shannon Sharpe, an entrepreneur who, has the possibility of making millions of dollars in the future. Right, so I need for folks to just understand. Let me also say, too, that his money matters because people's net worths always matter in cases involving punitive damages. Folks, in civil court, net worths matter. Right? Think about the Diddy case. Right? Had Diddy been a guy who was broke or who was making minimum wage, who wasn't some impresario presiding over a rap empire, right? If Diddy's not the head of Bad Boy Records, understand, Cassie wouldn't be able to get a settlement of $30 million. Cassie might not even sue Diddy because Diddy would be what we call judgment proof in civil court. So in civil cases, there is a showing on how much a person's making. If you're someone like Shannon Sharpe, who has a multi-million-dollar podcast business that's growing, right? I understand even in that business he works for others. We'll talk about how he could have changed his life by just having things set up a little bit differently. But just understand, the fact that Shannon Sharpe makes a lot of money, the fact that Shannon Sharpe is worth a lot of money, matters in cases like this. So the race gap, the age gap, the wealth gap, folks, it all matters. The sexual habits, from what I'm hearing, these two may have been involved in role-playing. Right? You know the role-playing, right? Your girl is pretending to be a cop. You're pretending to be the criminal she's arresting. The two of you are saying a lot of things. I understand there are texts here. Right? You have to think about all of that. The text may have been in furtherance of a role. Who knows? Right? A couple has their own private fantasy. So just understand, you have texts here. The text might even not convey the mood in the room at the time things happened. So let's speculate. Let's say that Tony Busby, a repeat player in cases like this. You have to think about the strength of the lawyering. Right? She's represented by experienced counsel here. Right? Understand, Busby couldn't go forward with the case against Diddy and Jay-Z because the evidence he had wasn't as strong as the evidence here. Right there, he had someone who wasn't quite sure where she was taken, statements that didn't conform with where the people she was accusing were at the time, and things like that. Here, there's no dispute that these two were sexually involved. Right? The dispute here is one of context, not the fact that they were involved. So let me just say here, you're a black guy with a much younger white woman. You have wealth that she doesn't have, right? Let's speculate further. You're involved in S&M, restraints, maybe even collars that other people wouldn't understand, right? Let's just keep it frank, right? She sends you a text. The text said, hey, when I said no last night, I meant it. Folks, whatever happened last night, whatever happened, whether or not you thought you had consent, whatever your state of mind was last night, Folks, that's a 5 alarm fire, right? That's an existentialist threat to your future earnings capacity. Let's just think it through. Right now, here, Shannon had other problems, right? You know, Nassim Taleb, he's a public intellectual I follow. He calls a job an addiction, right? He believes that having a job makes people complacent, makes people rely too much on the income from that job, the salary they receive. Moreover, having a job places you at risk if you're not self-employed, right? Having a job places you at risk of being fired, right? So just understand, you show me the context in which someone is working for someone else, and I'll show you a single point of failure for their financial future, right? Understand, there are many influential people. Art Laffer, for example, who has worked with more than one president, right? He's advised people like Ronald Reagan. He's currently advising Donald Trump. Art Laffer, like Al Davis, the NFL owner, doesn't believe in job titles. He doesn't want to have to sit down and be vetted by Congress. He tells people like Reagan, like President Trump, he tells them, hey, look, I don't want a job. I'll work with you. I'll advise you. But I'm not going to be your employee. Right, folks, over the years, I can't tell you how many jobs I've been offered. Right? Understand, Shannon Sharpe took the job. Right? The worst part is, and no knock on the company, it's just a branding thing. His employer's Disney. Right? It matters. His employer is, pushing Mickey Mouse imagery. His employer runs amusement parks where they want kids to, look at Goofy, look at, Mickey Mouse, or at least people wearing Goofy and Mickey Mouse costumes. Right? And Disney wants those kids to have a magical adventure, not some fantasy that includes dog collars, S&M, handcuffs, restraints, sexual role-playing. Right? You understand, the adults in Disney's world have to be kid-friendly from an image perspective. Right? It's part of their business model. Right? I have a 10-year-old. Right? She, when she was younger, was a big Mickey Mouse fan. I understand. Many jurors would understand that Disney has certain image requirements that are consistent and in furtherance of their corporate purpose. Right? Shannon Sharpe was working for that kind of employer. Right? Number one, he was working for someone else. Number two, that someone else is trying to placate kids. Right? So let me just say, given that reality, and ESPN, a Disney company, has since cut Shannon Sharpe. But Shannon Sharpe has to realize that in a situation like that, fighting this out in court was not going to end well, whatever happened. right? If Shannon won the lawsuit, there would still be the group out there who, of course, would, you know, feel that he did something wrong. You know, there would be that group out there that would hear things like dog collar and stuff like that. Um, Not to say necessarily that a dog collar is involved in this case. I'm just throwing out the dog collar for illustrative purposes, right? Role playing, costumes or fantasies. Fantasies might, have a power dynamic in terms of the sexual activity, and they would be aghast, right? They would stop listening to great interviews he does of people like Cat Williams. So let me just say to younger people, because YouTube has shared with me in the past that some of my audience is younger people following this video, let me just say how Shannon can restructure, regroup, reemerge. Right? First, he has to realize that he is a celebrity. Right? Realize that making YouTube videos isn't that hard. I'm sure he's figured that out already. And he needs to own his own economic content. Right? He can't rely on corporate backers. Folks, that doesn't work. Right? He needs to have things set up where people are working for him. He's not working for others. Right? The thing with the Diddy case that's interesting is people work for Diddy. He doesn't work for them. Right? And so, there wasn't the corporation that could gain some big advantage, some leg up in the public by saying, we're firing Diddy. Right? Even though, as we've learned, a jury heard all of these claims and busted Diddy for what? Being involved with prostitutes. That's the nature of his conviction, not the other stuff, right? Diddy's not a racketeer. A jury has told us that, right? But we understand the charges were more salacious than that. But Diddy, as he himself talks about, signs the front of checks, not the back of checks. Right? Understand, Diddy, there's no Disney overlay with Diddy. Right? Now, Diddy was someone who, endorsed things. To the extent he did that, okay, some people who were endorsed by Diddy have distanced themselves a little bit. Right? I haven't seen an Uber commercial involving Diddy for some time. But that's different than where Shannon was. Right? One of the problems with the entertainment industry is to be on a show like First Take, you have to work for the corporate backer if you're going to be a regular. Right? Shannon Sharpe needs to realize that if he's going to be a free man in America who dates who he wants, that consents, whether she's his age, whether she's his race or not. If he's going to be a guy in America who doesn't want to apologize for being involved in sex that might have restraints, then he has to make a decision. Am I going to be a representative for a corporation who is trying to, give kids at amusement parks fantasy-based experiences? Right? Let me also point out, too, and I need for young people especially to understand this. If you're an investor, particularly if you're an investor in a publicly traded company, right? If you make your money off stock appreciation and dividends in a capitalist society, right? You don't have to apologize for whatever lifestyle you have, right? It's your capital, you're investing it, you're not addicted to being an employee, right? Your performance evaluations come from people who actually know you and aren't, done with some salary in mind, right? Just food for thought. That's where Shannon Sharpe needs to angle his life, right? Not toward getting jobs, but toward providing jobs, right? No one talks about it. The NFL is a big brand. You've had NFL owners busted in a massage parlor. You have another NFL owner who, had a kid out of wedlock, was financially supporting the kid, you know, get sued or, have that situation kind of like blowing up a little bit. The owner, I guess, got around a little bit more than his public image suggested. You don't hear about situations like that much, right? It's not the five-alarm fire of the Diddy trial or of the Shannon Sharpe situation, right? Understand, the President of the United States at one point had a black girlfriend. You don't hear about it, right? You don't hear about it because, of course, Donald Trump has owned his companies, licenses his name for other ventures, right? It'd be different if Donald Trump were an employee and, while the employer, isn't outwardly, racist and backing miscegenation laws, the employer might feel that, Donald Trump's just not presenting the image that we want that's consistent with our vision, right? People get fired for vague and ambiguous reasons in the corporate world all the time. So let me tell you what Shannon Sharpe has gained. And I know there's a cottage industry here online, including attorneys, saying, wow, he paid millions of dollars. You know what they say. Why is divorce so expensive? Because it's so damn worth it. Here, why is a civil settlement like this so expensive? Because it's worth at least that much to Shannon Sharpe. We all have heard of cases, particularly cases involving, sexual abuse, where people have been damaged. They haven't been able to fully get their lives back. Connie Francis died the other day, the great singer, right? She was in a hotel. She was raped. I was a little kid at the time. I remember how being victimized in that way actually casts a cloud. It was a different time over Connie Francis, right? Many people don't make it back from sexual assaults. We understand that if we were to monetize the amount of harm they've suffered, it would be in the tens of millions of dollars. Now, I don't know what happened here. I don't have an opinion on that one way or the other. But if this woman was sexually assaulted, the damage could be in the tens of millions of dollars. Now, anytime you set up a system, people are going to make claims. There are always going to be folks gaming the system, right? I don't know what happened here. But what I do know is, given Shannon Sharpe's wealth, the number at which he settled was a fair number, right? He has to think about, going forward, the possibility that people are going to make charges like this against him, particularly now that this settlement is out in the public light. So here, with the settlement, while he's been fired by ESPN, he gets to continue to pursue his business ventures, his private business ventures, right? That should be his focus. he gets to control the narrative. There won't be a book written by her, right? I'm assuming this settlement has a confidentiality clause. The actual facts get to stay private, right? With Diddy, we know what was presented in court. Here with Shannon Sharpe, nothing is going to be presented in court, right? He just needs to restructure things, right? If he did what's being alleged, he needs to completely rethink things. This settlement gives him a second chance. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Let me also say too that, I was raised in a family where, people would, tell me, and it's part of my personality I like a lot. People feel free to tell me, Rich, you're full of S, right? Self-censoring, right? You're full of S, right? People tell me all the time, right? You're wrong, blah, blah, blah. Don't be hesitant to disagree with me in the comments section of this YouTube video. I'm a big boy. I can handle it, right? Let's just keep it real. Shannon Sharpe here found himself in a bad situation. He may have put himself there. I don't know, right? But once you're in a situation like this, I believe he took the best way out, right? Moral victories in your mid to late 50s aren't worth it, man. You know what I mean? Here, he needs to realize, hey, I'm living this life. This is the risk involved. This exploded on me. Let me get out of this so I can live the rest of my life, 20, 25 years I have left, right? Continuing to pursue ventures I like without public allegations, or without allegations hitting the front page of sports publications. Those are my thoughts. I look forward to yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. And if I'm Shannon Sharpe too, I think to myself, wow, maybe I need to start investing in Bitcoin and, vibrant stocks, even in this overbought economy, right? And relying on dividend income, annuity income, whatever the income is, and move away from relying on wages. Maybe I need to reconfigure my life so, there isn't the public spectacle of an employer showing me the door. Those are my thoughts. I look forward to yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.